Thank you very much for joining in today. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we had to switch over to an online session today. But I really appreciate you coming on board, and hopefully this did not cause you any inconvenience. Today's session is going to be covering on sprawl, and it's a fairly easy lecture, nothing too nothing too difficult to comprehend, but it is still something that is very much relevant and something that we've seen in a lot of cities and the patterns of growth that have sort of occurred. And it's important for us to talk about it, considering the fact that, it is a global metropolis course. And since a lot of cities around the world are facing this phenomenon, it is important for us to understand the implications of it, understand the reasons why this is occurring, and then also discuss a few of the potential solutions in terms of what can be done about it. So today's lecture is going to cover these three main aspects. What we'll also do is talk a little bit about the main final assessment at the end of the session today, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have in regards to that. Without further ado, let's begin with the session. So the first thing is we need to understand what sprawl really is. And if you really think about it, wherever you've sort of grown up and wherever you're living, cities have been continuously expanding, and we have sort of seen that from the very beginning of the first lecture, that cities are becoming a lot more urbanized. But at the same time, we've also noticed that cities are growing, not just only in terms of population, but also rather in terms of its own size-wise. So they tend to typically grow out more horizontally. So the way a lot of the cities around the world, particularly in the United States as well, we've noticed that the desire for cities to become a lot more sustainable and livable, that has sort of come up at the turn of the century as an important consideration to have. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of these cities expand in terms of their major footprint. And a lot of the suburbs are part of the cities, and including a lot of the small towns that are located on the urban peripheries are also then becoming part of the larger city. So all of this ultimately shapes or has the consequence on not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the social conditions of that area. And then that also then begins to inform the community. So one of the kind of development pattern that has emerged is to look at it in terms of sprawl as part of a low density or a haphazard development that is essentially spiraling outward. And what that means is that in one definition, and this has been fairly a common definition now, is that we have a lower density development that is consistently low on a much larger scale. And the distinction here is that it's a low density development, which is different to a suburban development. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the two distinctions really are. But sprawl is mainly characterized by a low density development that is occurring on a much larger land area. And typically, sprawl also then denotes that it is also consuming a lot of the resources. And by that, what we mean is, look, it takes a lot of energy to power those houses. It takes a lot of infrastructure to be put in place in order to service those areas. So a sprawl ultimately is just a much larger development on a much larger spatial area. So that's one way of a definition. The other definition that we've seen is what we call an outward expansion from the urban center. So that the city is still in much more of a nucleus, and then there are these peripheral developments that are occurring that are happening on the outer fringes, and they are still part of that city, but they are much more outward. So the opposite to that would be if cities are not growing outward, they're then growing vertically. which is on high density. So sprawl is different to that effect. So what does that really mean? That means is that there are certain characteristics associated with it. And the first one is that it has a lack of or a lack of diverse programmatic features. And that is essentially a lack of different kind of land uses. So typically you'll see suburban areas having a lot more houses on much wider areas. So they would be housing developments that sort of consume not only a large area on a large parcel of land, but they also have a typical kind of a characteristic, which is they could be on a large vacant land or even different sizes of it. But the density generally is something that is fairly common, which is a low density component of it. So depending on whether they are on a lot size, which is larger or smaller, but the unit itself is typically a single dwelling unit for only a one single family use. So that's the number one characteristic. The other one is that it looks at more of it takes up a large area essentially, and it spirals out from the main urban center. So if it's expanding outward from the urban core, let's say about 80% of that acreage is used for housing, and very little of that has anything else in between. So you see scores and scores of these houses and nothing else. There are no shopping malls, there are no shopping centers, there's no schools or something of that nature. So imagine traveling from this area all the way to somewhere further away by car generally, and in order to get something, going to a shop or to visit a doctor. So there's very little of anything else happening apart from the fact that there's only just residential. And I also want to make a distinction here that it's not a question about good or bad. It's just describing the characteristics about what sprawl really is, and we'll get to the consequences of it in a moment. But the other components associated with sprawl is that we have this residential development, but they are generally a lot more gridded, or their connections are not that defined. So in effect, you can see various different typologies of how that sprawl is sort of manifested on that particular land area. And that is, we see it from a grid pattern all the way down to a disconnected pattern. So on one end of the spectrum, we have road infrastructure that sort of is connected everywhere. And then on the other end is a development type that is completely haphazardly disconnected. And we see, and there's a lot of sort of grays in between. So we'll see something like a leapfrogging kind of a development, which is a very well-known characteristic of sprawl, and that really is more of a dispersed development. And you'll see that a lot of in these diagrams that you see here, something like a dendritic manner, which is something like a cul-de-sac kind of street pattern. You see these neighborhoods in which it's not a throughway. They sort of terminate at a cul-de-sac and around, and then you have houses around it. So while it may serve well for that particular dwelling, but it's ultimately sort of fosters a lack of connectivity between different areas. And ultimately, it also leads to an obstacle in terms of walking, and reduces a lot of the walkability between different areas, and also creates a lot of barriers between different land areas. So then we also see other patterns of sprawl, which is essentially about sort of a high use of vehicular dependency, and that is that in a typical sprawl kind of area, majority of times the public transport is fairly not well connected, and it's not really provided in most cases. And so what that means is that you have to rely a lot on your vehicles or your cars to be able to get to where you need to go. Or even if you're traveling a kilometer away, you need to do so by car, and which is very a different kind of mobility as compared to a particular inner city area. So that edge between what is an urban area and what is a rural area, that sort of tends to be unclear in these areas because a lot of these sprawling residential developments, because they're extending outward from the urban centers, tend to blur that domain about where, at what point does a rural area begin, and at what point does an urban area end. And this encroachment is often then associated with creating an open space and it takes up the agricultural land as part of that development. And I'll show you a few examples of it. And I guess it's a lot easier to see it as part of an example rather than me just describing it. So what I'll do now is show you in terms of some examples, and we'll do a bit of a Google Earth exercise here. And let me now share that screen here. So, okay, so looking at, so this is Phoenix. So now let's just look at it from a holistic standpoint. So this is, as far as your eye can see, you can see all of this area is essentially part of Phoenix, right? And let's just measure it in terms of just its typical land area. And let's see here. So there you go. So from one end to the other, that's about 66 or 70 even kilometers. In fact, it's even extending all the way to about 100, more than 100 kilometers, right there already. So that just shows you the size of the city itself, how much it has really grown. And if you look at it from if you just look at it in any typical point down here, you'll see the kind of the development that I was just mentioning to you, the typical, hold on. And here you go. So you have the kind of, so you see a lot of this development is you have, what we're going to show you here is that much expansive use of land area. And it's kind of slow on my machine here, but typical residential development, which is just ultimately just scores of dependency on high car usage. And it's just extending all the way to this residential component right here. A typical residential area that is very little serviced. So you'll see very little amount of parks because the connotation here is that the houses themselves have their own yards. So you don't really, you don't provide as much as open spaces for the larger public. So a lot of the lots themselves are a lot more private. And you see, stuff like this. A typical dwelling, single unit, and that this is extending for miles and miles ahead. And no matter where else you go, in other places, you see that this is true. So whether it is in Phoenix, but also in other places like Des Moines. In fact, we can also visit that. So feel free to put any other city that you want, that you wish to show, and I'll do a bit of a walkthrough over there. And so this is Des Moines. So Des Moines is in Iowa in the US. And you can see just by the size of it, again, if you just do a bit of a measurement between from one end to the other end, and there you go. It's already about, so about, let's say, 50 kilometers or so is sort of the area, and you see and you notice if you look here, you see a lot of these squiggly lines. So if you travel there, and the reason you might also notice is how this is in a 1 square mile grid, and that has to do with zoning, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you'll see that within that 1 square mile sort of an area, you have the typical kind of residential development. And this is what I'm talking about, the kind of the disconnected nature of things. So you have one typical street, and try imagine if you live here, you have to go by car in order to get groceries, or even go to school, or to drop your kids off, or to go to work. It's a fairly high car dependent sort of an area, and it's typical which we see. But the question really is, what is being asked here is that, is this the kind of development that we can foresee in the coming years? And the question really isn't about whether it's good or bad, but rather, is this the way? Is this the future? So if the population is growing continually, are we going to continue on this kind of a development trend? And just to give you a bit of a contrast, I'll show you one of the European cities, and we'll see there how sort of how uniquely different that is to this area. So this is Toulouse in France. And if you just do the same measurement of that area, so let's say from one end to the other, this would be generally not as much. So let's say about 30 kilometers from one end to the other. Obviously, there are certain natural barriers that sort of dictate how the city tends to grow outward. So in this case, we have a central river that is running, and then sort of that sort of geography is kind of influencing the spatial direction of how the city grows. But let's say, I just want to show you here the difference, a slight difference between how we see sprawl in the US versus how we typically see in Europe. But you'll notice a lot of the here you go. So not a good one. We'll see, let's go somewhere in the residential development. And let's go here. So if you notice in this one, the number one difference you might notice is the kind of the dwelling typology that is slightly different. So here's a typical sprawl, what we would consider as sprawl in European countries. And you'll notice that the dwelling typology is slightly changing. And it's getting a bit more denser than the typical example that we have seen in the United States. But ultimately, it still has the same characteristics, that is still housing a single family, and for much longer extensive land area. So ultimately, that's the overall characteristics of how we look at how we begin to define what sprawl really is. Any other city that anyone would like to talk about? They're also feel free to put those in the chat, but there are also other places like in Las Vegas is really kind of like a poster child for what is considered as sprawl, and you see here that the city is expanding. I mean, continuously. So it's in between the sort of a desert area and the city that goes on and on and on, and it's typical of the same kind of residential development that is for miles and miles away. And so the question really is, like, at what point do we stop? At what point do we begin to curtail that development? And even sprawling even extends between different cities. So here is the example of Dallas and Fort Worth. So this on the right is Dallas, on the left is Fort Worth. And so that is basically a combination of two different cities, and they're now just part of as one. And you see miles and miles of that sort of development. So that is now beginning to join the two cities together. And if you're landing in Dallas, you have a one singular airport right in between, and that's right here up on, you know, and that sort of services these two cities. And it's a fairly large, important city, or rather city region. So, but it is ultimately characterized by the same kind of development, which is low dense on a much larger land area. And as a result, we see that, and I'll show you a few examples. It's always interesting to see. I mean, we're looking at it from a, higher end, but look at anywhere you zoom in, you'll see the, kind of development that is just typically sprawling. So the question really is, at one point do we begin to really distinguish between the kind of developments that we see in other places, right? So ultimately, then now I want to talk about the question is, okay, so if we have this as the way that is occurring, and even if we go in Europe, we tend to see this stuff. So we see, with the nature of sprawl is that as cities tend to expand, some of these developments that occur are a lot more leapfroggy in nature. So what that really means is that you have a major city center that expands. Then you have what we call a natural boundary, which it would be a sort of a forest area or a natural reserve area. And then another development that is sort of leapfrogging or jumping over from that area and then begins to have the same kind of development. So as opposed to a high density area, you have the single dwelling that is being developed here. So imagine you're laying down a road and that is servicing only one single dwelling, or sort of maybe around 20 houses. And so you can see in the background, there's a lot more development back there, or let's say in the city, but then there's also a disconnect between certain regions. Then we also see kind of a sprawly development that is what we call as big box. So this is like the big centers that you see in different parts. So that would be a large industrial warehouses or shopping areas, something like IKEA, or in the US there's Walmart. There might be some version of that in different places. So in Europe there's Primark. So those are large. The typical characteristic is that there's a large warehouse surrounded by a much bigger parking area, and it's only servicing that one program. And the only way to get to this area is through the cars, through vehicles, and then that's a typical characteristic of that. You see that in Brisbane as well. So if I guess this kind of version would be where current North Lake, so the IKEA is, and so that sort of area, the Westfield malls. So that's a typical characteristic of a large development of this nature, and then residential developments surrounding it. And that's what we would call as big box. Then the other examples are something like the greenfield development. So sprawling is something like you have these large lots, and these are sort of single houses. And the houses themselves are, they have varying sizes in between. So some are, maybe even 2-bedroom, 3 bedrooms, or sometimes even mansions. But the typical, the characteristic is, again, that regardless of the lot size, you see a cookie cutter response. So you have a typical house that is sort of going on and on for a much larger area. And the greenfield component of this one is that it's always built on a newer piece of land. So it's typically on a much area that is outside the city. So the city continually expands on a much greener pasture outwards, because it's a lot easier to build that way. And you can see here that this is where the farm area is, and right next to it is the residential development. And then there's more and more developments that are occurring, and we see that happening. Then there are also some examples of alligator ones. So alligator is more like this kind of development that was envisioned in that area, but for some reason did not really materialize. Examples of these are in Florida mainly. So they anticipated a lot of growth, and then they built up that infrastructure, and but ultimately it did not result in any sort of a development. But we see less and less examples of that now, because majority of times, because of the housing crises that we're seeing a lot around the world, these sort of alligator structures, typical sort of sprawling types, are not really there anymore. They're sort of filled in. But nonetheless, there are, for the turn of the century, there were a lot of these sort of typical sprawling typologies emerging, in which there were roads that were sort of put in place, but then very little development that was still occurring. So, and that's the reason why we call them as alligator skins, because they're just empty pieces of land. Then we also have what we call as ballparks. So this is more characteristics of that you have a large, a typical entertainment venue, and typically it's more like stadiums that are sort of constructed. So think in terms of Olympics, think in terms of these major sporting events, and that those are typically constructed on the outer cities fringes. So as a result, you'll see this pretty much in the world over, really, these large stadiums, and then you have much larger parking spaces allocated around it. And in order to get to these places, obviously you need cars to get there. But then very little of that public transport is sort of provided in order to service that, because for various reasons. But then ultimately what the effects of this is that you have one larger ballpark kind of development occurring, and then around it you have a lot more residential development occurring around it. So, and that's a typical approach towards how cities tend to grow outward, because of you're constructing these structures continually, and because a lot of it is not done so in the inner city areas, so it makes a lot more sense to do it on the outer fringes. So think it in terms of your cities, the one that you're looking at. How many of those cities have a structure of this nature, or a stadium, or a major sporting venue, or even an entertainment venue? Think of convention centers, think of large sort of these business parks that are situated on the outer skirts. And as a result of that, you have residential development, typical residential development occurring over there. Then we also have seen examples of other sprawling typologies, which is something like a drive-through. And I think this is something that is fairly common. We've seen even in Brisbane, in pretty much around the world, really. And this is like a drive-through for a typical restaurant chain, like Hungry Jack's or McDonald's. And you see that along these major arteries, a lot of these sort of businesses are opening up and are being propped up, where the main thrust of it is that in order to get to them, or in order to get the service, you have to sort of drive through them. So it's very car dominated. It's very serviced towards the car, because that's typically where people are spending a lot of their times now, that in order to get to and from work, they're commuting. And it's now a lot more typical for people to be spending a lot more time on the road, 1 hour, 45 minutes each way. And as a result, we have a lot of these businesses that are sort of servicing and catering to that kind of typology. And this is also what we call a rural slammer. So this is the typical example of this one is like you have a residential development that is very little, that is completely disjointed with the rest of the city. So it is, we see some of this in Europe primarily. So think of Frankfurt, for example. You have the major city, and then a rural residential development, way outside. It has very little to do with the city itself, but it is just a residential community. A good example of this one, in fact, it would be nice to show you on Google thing as well, is Atlanta. So I'm not sure if you'll ever get a chance to visit Atlanta ever, but it's something still to know because Atlanta is a very typical example of sprawly sprawl. So even before this sort of, if you ever happen to travel to Atlanta, so about 45 minutes before you actually land, you'll see this sort of rural slammers emerging, and it's not loading for a second. I want to really show you Atlanta. It's a good example to see. Let me try some other browser. Okay, so this is Atlanta. And if we just look at it from, let me show you the satellite view. It's really interesting. So, okay, so now we're really zoomed out, but so 45 minutes before you even, here's what I mean by these squiggly lines. So you see miles and miles of these typical kind of residential, these squigglies, what I'm calling them, and they emerge just randomly. So here you go. So as you expand, just randomly like that. This is what it's called, rural slammer, and just like that, and they just emerge out of nowhere. So you have just, in this residential area, you just have this one thing, right? Just randomly, and so there's very little of that regulation that sort of determines whether what kind of all of these squigglies. So you're about to land and you'll see, you'll notice them, and they go on for miles and miles and miles. And the land itself is a very huge city, but this is where you tend to land, and you'll see these squigglies emerging, and that's what we call as rural slammers. So on the chat, I've noticed that there's a mention about Costco. So yeah, that's a good example of the kind of the typical residential development that is occurring alongside, and based on a big box thing. Finally, there are also some typical examples of what we call as snout houses. So what this really means is that so a lot of the times the residential development that is sort of permitted has a typical a snout. So like a pig or any kind of a animal. So you have a house, and then you have a garage that is sort of snouting outward. So let's say on the frontal area, so let's say about 100% of the total frontage of a house, about 40 to 50% of that frontage is being taken up by a garage. Again, it's typically sort of dominated by for a car or sort of servicing a car. And as a result, you see this kind of residential development for miles and miles. And that's what we mean by a typical suburban sprawl that is occurring throughout. So now what we do know is that, regardless of the kind of, whether it's a rural slammer, or whether it's or a big box kind of development, that we're seeing that this sort of pattern of development is occurring throughout the world, and it's sort of expanding. And regardless of, so on this graph, what you see here is that the trend typically is upward. And so cities with the most sprawl, as even before 1990s, this is not too long ago, has expanded. And you see that the expansion itself, the main thing to look at this graph is the steepness, the slope at which it's actually growing upward. And so we know that from previous lectures that the cities are expanding, but what's really expanding here is the fact that the pace at which it is expanding. And the pace itself is also being influenced by the kind of development, the kind of that we see, and then it is expanding spatially outward. And if this is going to continue on, we'll see that this typical arrangement of this uniformity of land use, large footprints, poorly connected street grades, or in high dependency is occurring across the board. So now the question is, why does it? Why are we really doing this thing? Okay, so is it, and this is where we tend to begin to talk a little bit about the consequences of that. So the number one reason, and not only number one, but rather one of the major reasons is that it has to do with the socioeconomic factors, typically. So what do we mean by that? It is that it is an interrelatedness of the cultural forces as well as the economic forces. And so the notion here is that land, or rather the land value, is what is often determining the chief determinant of why this development takes place. So sprawl typically tends to occur where the property values are a lot lower. So think of in terms of cities. So if cities themselves, where essentially the jobs are, the property values are going to be typically much higher. But on the periphery areas, the land value is going to be typically lower. And as a result, that's where sprawl then tends to occur. So the economists essentially just say that, the underlying factors that sort of interact with land values is the fact that they create that spatial expansion outward. And the underlying factor to that one is a population growth. That is, that's the main determinant. So there are a lot more people. And that results in much more outward growth from the city center. And as people tend to sort of move out of the city, and so the population declines in the inner city areas, and that sort of is a push towards why people want to expand outwards. The second is that the incomes are rising of people. So generally, as incomes grow, people tend to purchase larger homes. And because larger spaces are only available in sort of outer areas, so that's a fundamental driver of why people tend to move outside, and why sprawl is occurring. Then the other reason why they talk about this is that because land values are typically lower in outer fringes, therefore that means that the housing is going to be less expensive on the outer peripheries. So the closer you get to the city, the more expensive the housing gets. And so those three things in combination drive the kind of growth that is occurring in terms of sprawl. But then there's also another factor, in which the economists then say that there is an often association of a decrease in consumption of commuting costs. So what that really essentially means is that the typical development that is occurring outward, the cost for it is much less. So you need a car in order to get there. You don't need to provide infrastructure in terms of buses, public transport, or anything of that nature from a city standpoint. So as a result of that, it's a lot easier just to develop outwards because those are going to be serviced by cars anyway. So typically the person who's actually living there is the one who needs to go there. So you don't need to provide a lot more services to that. A countermeasure to that one is from a countermeasure is that from the city standpoint, they say, well, it's a lot easier to build new than to service existing structures. And so think of it in terms of that it's a lot easier to build a new road than to maintain and refix the existing one, because there are a lot more factors associated with that one. So as a result, you'll see a lot more newer kind of development, which is better road, better service, better amenities, better way of laying down the pipes for drainage, for for electricity than it is to resurface an existing one. So that is one driving factor. The other one is that it homogenizes the social class. So what basically means that everyone ultimately gets a slice of the pie. So if everyone wants a typical house with a yard, and if we are limiting or restricting people from getting that, then that's not the desire there. We want everyone to be able to pursue that Australian dream or that American dream. Everyone should have the ability to be able to get the kind of home that they want to live in. And if we restrict them, then that's not good. So, but ultimately what we've seen is that so many people want it in that, that sort of Australian dream or American dream. So the growth of having a sprawl that is occurring outward is something that is just naturally occurring because everyone wants that. Then there's also some obsession, what we call obsession with newness. That people tend to move out because inner cities have a general tendency to decline. So the houses themselves are not of high value in terms of quality. So it's a lot easier to build new, and if you're building new on a much less expensive piece of land with better quality home, so that means that you can, everyone wants something new. So that's that obsession that since everyone wants that begins to be a concern. Then there's also a view of how the public sees land. So typically, the notion here is that because there's abundance of land available, why not just naturally grow outward? Okay, so in that regard, the public sort of considers that there's a limitless availability of land, and therefore the tendency is just to continue expanding outward. In certain areas, in certain cities, that might not be possible from a physical standpoint, spatial area standpoint, but in terms of what we call, allowing for a lot more development that to occur on an outward area, that spatial area, because it allows it, that is possible. And finally, I think the most important one, and that's not really typically covered in a lot of literature, I think it has to do with zoning. And this really emerged as a discussion in the late 19th century. So up until about 1800s, late 1800s, 1900s, you could pretty much do anything you wanted with the kind of land area. So you could build any kind of development, whether it was a shop of some kind, a prairie, or a house, or whatever. There were absolutely no restrictions. But that sort of emerged, it changed when it came to zoning. So zoning particularly deals with what you, so here it is that the city or the municipality or the sort of dictates what you can do on that area. And more typically, they sort of specify what you cannot do in that area. And as a result, what we've seen is that there are developers who are restricted. So you cannot build, let's say, a higher residential tower right next to a single dwelling home. You cannot build a factory right next to a hospital, for instance. So there are rules about what can be done and what cannot be done. And that's where zoning comes in. So the argument here is that zoning is what is driving spatial growth outward, because zoning sort of typically prevents the kind of development that is occurring within inner cities. So for instance, think of it in terms of Brisbane, if you go to West End or these typical areas, there are older houses that are protected by zones, so you cannot demolish them. So if you cannot do that, so as a result, what zoning encourages is that in order to have a newer kind of development, that is only possible outward in outer urban fringes, and that's a typical thing about zoning. So the question now comes down to is, what do we do about it? Why is this such a big problem? Okay, so there are certain sort of discussions in literature that have talked about it. One is sort of this book that has been written by Wolf, and that talks about Euclid versus Ambler. So this is a very good account of how zoning really came about. So Ambler, in this case, is a developer, and the city of Euclid, and this was a very important a case. And I think this is one of the reasons why there was a birth of zoning, at least in the United States, and then later on in the rest of the world as well. So the company Ambler, wanted sort of took the city of Euclid to court, and saying that the city is preventing us from for building the kind of development that we need, and that is resulting in decrease in the value of the company. So Ambler won that case. The company that won that case, but then ultimately the case went to the Supreme Court, and in that instance, the city won, and that was in which the verdict really was that at this point, no, the city has the need to protect the general public's concerns, and the rights of the property developers do not really overtake the needs of the larger community. So in that case, the rules were that no, the city and the community needs to specify and zone out what can be typically constructed on that area and what cannot be done. And that extended a lot more, not just in terms of the spatial dimension to it, like, in terms of how big you can build it, but also in terms of how, from an environmental standpoint, that you cannot begin to demolish or, clear out agricultural land or sort of these forests in order to make way for newer developments. So that's was the birth of how zoning sort of came into play. We'll talk about it in different lectures as well, about the overall consequences of that in terms of what could be prescribed as the rules. So in certain areas, the rules are a lot more relaxed than they are in other places. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Then we've also seen examples of other, there's also a very interesting book by Ellis, and that is, I highly encourage you to take a look at it. And that's, the England and the octopus, that's like the central area, and how that is beginning to sort of spread out horizontally throughout. So there are both good and bad things associated with that, but ultimately that critique ultimately enabled was to create that kind of discourse in literature about how we really address this issue, and what do we really do about it, because we can't continue to spread outward. There has to be some sort of limit to it, and there are certain consequences associated with that. And one of the biggest consequences associated with that is the reliance of automobiles, which has resulted in an overall reduction in air quality. And as a result of that, that also means that there is an accelerated depletion of the fossil fuels that in order to power that thing. So in the US, for example, there were a lot more motor vehicles, and that exceeded the overall population growth. So there were more cars than there were people. So people had more, one individual would actually have 2 cars or even more. And that sort of created that there were more cars on the road, which means that there were more roads that were needed, and that meant there were longer distances than ever before, and that was a big problem. Similarly, there were also issues associated with sprawl, in which, because typically the waterways tended to become a lot more polluted because of sprawl, and that has largely to do with the impervious surfaces. So think of in terms of roads. There's very little of natural land and more of a concrete surface that is now sort of dominating the land area. And as a result, that sort of creates a lot more pollution, typically for our rivers and waterways. And thinking in terms of the large area, if this is sort of going on pretty much on a large expanded area, this becomes a big problems down the road, which then also leads to a loss of disruption for the environmentally sensitive areas. So think of in terms of natural habitats. So this has to do a lot more with the wildlife. So there will be a loss of natural habitat for them, and this becomes a big problem because you'll tend to typically see signs that say koala wildlife sanctuaries or kangaroos or any kind of wildlife, and that is around beginning to intersect with where humans are living, so or human habitats are, and that becomes a big problem. And from not only from a biodiversity standpoint, but also in terms of the sort of the natural area for forests and reserves, and you can pretty much imagine the kind of natural disaster that can result out of that. And it also then leads to a reduction in open space. And so in term, and because of that, and then it leads to a lot more risks of flooding. It overall reduces the quality of life of that area. But then also the from the spatial standpoint, then there's also the pace at which that consequence of sprawl impacts. So, and that has to do with the consumption of land and the rate at which it is being done. So what we know is that land is being now consumed at much faster rate, and that is more so than in the population itself. So there's a shift of population from the inner urban areas to suburban regions. And the rate at which this is happening is creating the population, creating that problem. So, for example, the population of Chicago between the years 1990 or between the years from 1950 to 2000 in the last, so that really grew by 48% or 50%, something of that. The population grew, but the land area of Chicago grew by more than 100%, more than 150%, rather, between the same time frame. So, so that shows the level of expansion in terms of spatial outward, and that doesn't really reflect that there are more people, but rather the land is being consumed a lot more at a much faster pace. And the same thing happened in Boston as well. So the land that had been developed in the last 40 years or so, it is nowhere near the rapid sort of population growth that was much more apparent in other places, and as a result, we see that the spatial footprint of those areas are that much greater than the population themselves. So if there are certain graphs that we see even online that the city footprint in terms of how much population there is in that footprint versus how much people are occupying that area. So we'll see that in typical suburban areas, you have very little population, but much larger land area. And that's a typical negative consequence of sprawl. And we see that a lot more in the leapfrogging kind of development patterns, which sort of further create that problem because they ultimately leave patches of open land, and those are sort of intermingled with a lot of the built-up areas. So think of in terms of roadways and fences and other sort of this infrastructure, which ultimately abrupt or even sometimes create barriers to a wide-ranging species who are ultimately inhabiting those areas. And I believe that this sort of negative association of sprawl needs to be counterbalanced. And that's really the main argument of this lecture here, that we need to somehow come up with a much better way of balancing between the kind of development pattern that we typically see, and based on the issues that we are currently facing, typically about housing affordability and the opportunities of providing housing to everyone. So if there's limited land available and we're still constructing the same kind of residential development, then it is going to drive up and exacerbate the kind of housing affordability issues that we are currently facing. And on top of that, we're also not going to see a lot the higher quality of life that we want. So a typical sprawl is not the kind of high quality of life that is typically associated with livability. So, I mean, one could argue that, the pandemic sort of changed the dynamics slightly, but we're also beginning to see that not as much. So, the ability to work from home, you know, kind of changed the dynamics a little bit. People did not really need to commute to work as much, but that is beginning to change again. But nonetheless, it does not really take away from the fact that you're living on a much further away land area in a land area, and you're still physically disconnected from the city center where there may be a lot more services or the amenities that are provided. So if you're living in an outer suburb and you get sick, the main hospital that has the kind of care that you need is only situated closer to the city center. So that's a big problem right there in that regard. So let's talk a little bit about the solutions and some of the critiques of suburbia. So why does sprawl really occur? So one of the big reasons why sprawl is associated with happening is, or rather the critique of that is that there are no jobs associated with sprawl. So and the notion here is that the employment centers are not really where they need to be, because that and so as a way to circumvent that, the notion there is that the jobs themselves then tend to move where the people are. So then you create off employment centers, you create these office parks, and so the notion here is that okay, so jobs go to where the people are. The other critique to sprawl itself is that there's way too much sprawl in itself. So the countermeasure towards that is that, okay, let's just increase the density and enhance the planning mechanisms. So some of these solutions tend to, or some of the solutions to these critique tend to work well in some cases, but typically they don't always work. And something like they say about sprawl is that it has no character. It's a typical house that is you see pretty much everywhere. And the examples that I just showed you earlier today, you'd be really hard pressed to identify which a city that sprawl or that house really is, because it's really very similar. So whether you're in Des Moines or Chicago, Boston, Frankfurt, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, any kind of sprawling development really has no character. And so the counter solution to that one, it was the emergence of this notion of new urbanism, and that's really about introducing newer architectural typologies or newer designs, and sort of providing guidelines that specify what kind of development should really occur in the future. So it really focuses a lot more on walkability, on livability, and that's the charter of new urbanism. And so it's a way of addressing the lack of character that we typically see in sprawl. Then the other critique about sprawl itself is that there are no amenities. So it's just housing, nothing else. There are no shops, there are no schools, very little healthcare facilities, very little entertainment facilities. So it's just that. So the countermeasure to that one is, okay, well, we'll provide access to those amenities So the state then says, from the public sector, they'll say we'll provide the mass transit as a solution. So they provide buses or their road or the trains to that. But majority of times, we see examples of that, that regardless of where you live in these sprawling areas, very little of that sort of mass transit is sort of provided to you. And then the question also comes down to is then who pays for that? From the developer-led, they tend to be more private car oriented. So you see a lot more increase in vehicles, kilometers traveled. So there's a lot of these residential master plan communities are really car dominated. So you have your major arterieway, major road, and then as in the case that we've seen in those snout houses, uh, those houses are really serviced for cars. Very little of that is, let's say, there's very little of higher density allocated. So, and it's very car dominated. So the other thing about is the lack of services that are being provided there. So as a result, what we see is the solution to that, rather, is that they want to provide transit-oriented development. So we say that, okay, all developments must occur on that notion. So we see examples of transit-oriented development occurring, and that's there. So. So now let's talk about the sprawl itself, or rather the solution to sprawl itself. So what I would like us to do is to just take about a few moments, and here's a chart. I would like us to list down one solution that you think could be a solution to the sprawl, and then talk about one good thing of it and one countermeasure to that. So just, providing a solution and critiquing that solution as well. We'll spend about, let's say, 20 minutes in this exercise, and then we'll reconvene, and then I'll show you some examples, or rather talk about some of the solutions to sprawl that have been sort of discussed in literature as well. Okay, how does that sound? Okay, so just fill out this chart, and then we reconvene in about 20 minutes. Okay. Okay, so great. Thank you very much for filling this out. So let's talk about it. I think some of the solutions are, I mean, it's really important to think about, what can really be done. So I can see that the first one is improving services for areas. It needs to have sufficient things like emergency services, local markets, restaurants, markets, shopping centers. That's good. Yeah, absolutely. Improving services would certainly curtail sprawl. And I think by this, I'm presuming you mean improving services in the sort of this outer suburb. Is that the right presumption here? Yeah. The other is reasonable and long-term regional planning. Industry should be clustered in a specific area to produce cluster effect. That's actually a good one. I actually like that too. So, and that I think touches very closely upon the transit-oriented development notion as well. With the idea there is to cluster a lot of the services and the amenities, specifically looking at industry here. So that makes sense to do. So that's a good one. In order to solve the problem of urban sprawl, more public facilities should be introduced in the area, for instance, to provide shopping centers or public transport systems. So yeah, I think so too. I think the facilities need to be provided because that's where people are. So that's certainly a very, very viable viable solution. Absolutely. In Chile, oh, good. There's an example here too. Good. In Chile, one thing that has been done is that they have restricted the subdivision of land with agricultural characteristics. So if you want to buy a parcel and subdivide this land, 0.5 factor is smaller than. Okay, that's a very good one. So yeah, so this plays around with the zoning component of it, absolutely. Um, and um, and yeah, so in certain cases we have seen in a lot more of mixed use uh, developments occurring, but in the case of agricultural characteristics, yeah. So subdivisioning of land is certainly a way to go. Other examples of urban infill and redevelopment. So that's yeah. So it promotes higher density and mixed use, but as you rightly said, it does require changes in effective zoning and land use regulations, which are very difficult to enforce. Certainly, I think it depends a lot on the location as well. So in certain areas, it is easier. But I guess if you think of major city centers, or these infill locations within the city center where there are these open areas, what you cannot do sometimes often is highlighted and emphasized a lot more. So yeah, you're right. It is very difficult to enforce. Retrofitting existing buildings in the urban area for residential purpose, basically to improve the overall density, but also utilize the space in the city. Yeah. So higher densification certainly is one of the solutions to sprawl. And yes, it has both the pros and the cons associated with it. So the pro is, as you said, higher utility of the space. And some of the cons might be about, um, the lack of space that people want, that they don't get in the city. But then also it pushes up the prices of the land. Setting limits on how far the urban development can extend. The pros to that is cities are not overdeveloped, and the cons are it meets the resistance from developers and landowners who do benefit from sprawl. That's actually a very good point. And so part of the reasons why it is sprawling is because the economic financial cost benefit ratio is that it favors sprawl. And so it is a lot easier or financially more rewarding to build in greenfield development. So that's certainly the case. And the other thing you've mentioned about setting limits. So some cities like Portland, Oregon, in the US have experimented with what we call as urban growth boundaries. So they establish a boundary around, at this point, the city cannot grow outward, spatially speaking. So what does that do? It sort of enforces all the development to occur within that boundary. So it is in both advantageous and disadvantage to the city. So from the benefit side is that it limits the amount of infrastructure that needs to be provided in order to cater to that population, because they're all contained within a prescribed area. So, for example, you construct a new train line or a tram line, and you know how many people are going to be using that, because you're not extending that train line further on because because the boundary is there. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage to that one is that yes, it is resistant to landowners who do benefit from it, but also the fact that it is a lot more costly to maintain. So it drives up the cost of the land, and that's not a good thing. The other ones is gentrification, so improving the quality of life for people who are living there. So providing an improved housing for the locals. Yeah, I think improving the overall quality would certainly would certainly help, but I would still question about the sort of like where is that happening? So if it's happening across the board, then at what point do we establish the limit, right? So the question is, if we improve the quality, and which we're seeing happening already in terms of these newer developments. So it's like if you look at Metricon, a lot of these private developers who are providing higher quality of development around. So, but that's not really stopping sprawl. It's still favoring the same kind of development, which is single dwelling residential development. But I guess you could argue that for the city center, that's where this might really be beneficial. So if you do provide better quality there, then that might be a reason for people to be attracted to that area and tend to just be there because it's higher quality. The reuse of land should be considered. And for example, the government could provide incentive to the developers to reuse the land and reduce the amount of people moving out. So yes, so that means zoning. So we need to reconsider how the city centers are being zoned at the moment. And I think I agree with you because many a times these cities are very rigid in terms of their laws and rules about what cannot be done. So thinking in terms of the heritage structure, so if a typical house that has been, let's say, 100 years old, and it's heritage listed, so it's really hard to change that. And so as a result, that becomes as a big barrier towards making improvements to that land. And that's yeah. So changing those rules is important, and changing it from a prescriptive perspective to a performance basis, and that is important. Also, if you want to develop a project, it has to be agricultural. Otherwise, you have to apply for approval and for land compensations. So you have to buy other land and improve its soil.
That was related with the example that I did from Chile.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. Yeah. So no, I agree. I think these sort of policy related mandates need to be revamped because right now policy in itself, what we have currently, is facilitating sprawl, and in changing that policy mechanisms is the way to go. And I think the one that you've offered here is a very viable one, and I think it has a lot of legs. It can really be very helpful in that regard. Finally, public transit expansion, and that supports higher density around transit hubs, but it may not be feasible in all areas, especially in less densely populated areas. So yes, agreed. So the experimentation with transit-oriented development has been applied the world over, really. In certain areas, it worked. In fact, we're going to talk about this one specifically next week when we talk about mobility and how transit expansion has sort of fared out, whether it was a good thing or bad, or how did it really manifest in terms of spatial expansion. But as you noted, that it did support a lot more higher density because people tend, it's a lot easier to be situated near a transit spot because it helps you get to your workplace and to a lot of the other amenities that you need. And it's a win-win solution in many regards. But yeah, it does not work in all areas, as you've noted. So so thank you for that. These are all really, sorry, there are more. There's improving the regional development planning scheme. So this has to do with policy, such as the SCQ regional plan in Queensland. So government support is absolutely a lot more important because it cannot be achieved without government intervention. And local government plays a very important role in that regard. So the state, in this case, so in Queensland, the state provides a plan, which is the regional plan, and the idea here is that the local governments are going to implement those plans. So so we need support. So I guess just outside Queensland, if you talk about other places, there always is a bit of a tussle between who does what. And so the state sometimes just chalks out the plan, and the local government does not have the means or the capacity to do so. It varies quite different from places to places, the implementation part of it at least. But yes, for the thrust of the argument that is being presented here is that we need to improve the development planning scheme, and I think that is an important consideration to have, and that it touches upon the policy mechanisms as well. Then we have building and upgrading public transit systems, and which is the advantage is that it decreases the traffic congestion, definitely, and the pollution that is emitted from those personal vehicles. But the cons is that there are higher upfront costs for infrastructure. And yes, so both are very valid concerns. And we'll talk about this one as well next week about mobility and why it makes sense and yet is not achieved, or at least implemented, or it takes a long time to do so. So we see examples of these transit stops around the world, which are really good, and they do cater to a lot of places. So why not do so in other places? And it does come down to cost, but it also comes down to other reasons, which is serviceability and the sort of the demand of that transit stop somewhere else. But you know, they're both sides to that argument. So very good. I think these are really good. I'm really happy to see these, and you've done rather well in them. And so I'm going to present a few of them as well. And this this sort of works on both ends of the spectrum. So at one end, we have the first one is the approach that governments tend to take is that sprawl is inevitable. This is going to end up happening anyway. So the solution to this is not provide a solution, which is do nothing, right? So the advantage to this one essentially is that it is a lot easier to do because it doesn't require much effort. It's both financially and economically and politically the easiest solution. But the problem with this one is that nothing changes. In fact, things get worse for that matter. And then the other one is, which you briefly touched upon, which is the size-based taxation, or sort of regulating the land at which the development is taking place. So the advantage of this one is that it hurts, though, it sort of, from a sprawl perspective, it hurts those who have a large home, right? So it encourages a lot more densification. But from a negative standpoint, or it actually makes things a little bit more difficult because it hurts families who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. And this goes to that point that you've just given an example from Chile. So it works in certain cases, but majority of times it tends to hurt the families who are with those large parcels. So there's always a debate between by what extent do we curtail or limit the amount of land that is allocated, and how much do we tax on it. So I'm not saying whether it's a good or bad thing, but I'm just saying that there's no easy solution to that. There's always an argument to it, but nonetheless, it is one of the proposals that has been presented about how can we control sprawl. Then we take a bit more extreme measures, which is taking a highly restrictive take on land. So we really restrict what cannot be built on that land. So the argument here is that land is very limited, and or at least the provision of the land is very limited, and therefore whether you restrict it in terms of creating a urban growth boundary, or you don't provide the land to begin with. So what that does is that it prevents from the land to really be built on the outer edges. So you have to really build it on where land is available. In certain cities, it is easier because the physical sort of spatial area prevents it from expanding. So think of rivers, think of open shores, or if it's an island land area. So you just cannot extend outward. So you have to go up. So that's there. But the downside to that is that it also then restricts the supply, because then less amount of people have access to the kind of dwelling that they want. So not everyone can then get that single dwelling unit that that is desired, and or they are then forced to live in these areas which are generally owned by private developers or private landowners, and they have multiple dwelling units there. So there are more and more renters and less landowners, and that drives up the cost as well. And on top of that, residential development of high density is situated near the city center, and it's really a lot more expensive, and as a result, it drives up the cost because there's less supply and more demand to coming in. So then there's the final one, which is what we call the missing middle. So this is more about the argument that, okay, it doesn't have to be on the either extremes. You can't just have a single dwelling and versus a high density dwelling. There has to be a bit of a middle ground in between that. So the advantage to that is that it opens up a whole host of possibilities to the kind of housing typologies that are available. So, think of it in terms of duplexes, in terms of mid-rise apartments that are not really too high dense, but they are somewhere in the middle, hence the name missing middle. And we see examples of these in a lot of European towns and cities where there are certain restrictions and the lands are a lot more regulated. So they specify, the kind of dwellings that there are there and the typologies. So, and they specify, the rules in terms of, how much square footage that they take up, where the windows are going to be, how much density they are going to have, and what kind of distances they will have between the lots. So those things are sort of regulated, and that is part of the missing middle guidelines. But the downside to that is that it makes a very difficult business case, particularly in places like Australia. It's not something that is common at all, or in fact preferred, for various reasons. And as a result, financially speaking, it is a lot more lucrative to have, a single dwelling that goes for about 500,000 or $1 million, and you have many of them. It's just way too financially lucrative from a provider's standpoint. So these I would say would be the four main solutions. Of course, there's a lot more in between them as well, but typically these are discussed in the literature quite often and sort of critiqued and debated in terms of where it works well and where it does not. But I would say that, in terms of not doing anything versus doing something, and then doing something but having a moderate way of approaching it, I think ultimately we may come down to having a much more moderate way of doing things, at least where this is, it seems to be heading. So you'll also see examples wherever you go, in which the kind of developments that are occurring are somewhere around this missing middle. So they're not really high dense and not too low dense. They're just somewhere in between, and we're seeing a lot more of them, more and more of them. Yeah. So that is it from my side today. Thank you very much for joining in and accommodating and seeing and attending the lecture online today. I'd be happy to take any questions. But before we go, I also want to talk a little bit about the assessment. So this is going to be due next week. So the two questions that are being covered, so one you've already begun talking about, which covers the housing affordability, which was covered the week before last. And the second question talks about the one today. So in all, the main criteria here is basically answering the question. And are you able to really provide and back up the arguments that you're presenting with an example? So if, so in the case of the first question, it is important to really look at the main significant factor that you think is driving the housing affordability, and then can you back that up with examples? And then based on the examples that you indicated, try to see if you can provide a balanced view, explain both in terms of the theory as well as in practice about how that affordability has been addressed. So if that's a problem, then what is being done about it, and what are the sort of theoretical backdrop to it. And similarly, the second question also talks about the same way. So provide a much more of a detailed critique of urban sprawl, at least from the same standpoint in terms of what is causing it and what are the impacts of it, and try to compare that in terms of an example that you see in your city or any other city, and just showcase and explain how this kind of sprawl is either a leapfrog, and what makes it such, and what are the effects and the impact that it has on that area. So overall, the essay isn't very long. It's about 1,500 to 2,000 words. That's just roughly about 2 pages or something like that, 2 or 3 pages. So in terms of referencing, yes, you do need to reference it. That uh, does not get counted towards the word count. And you're welcome to use any graphics or pictures that you may, or any charts for that matter, in order to support that argument that you're presenting, but just provide a bit of citations in order to support that. So if you're creating your own, just say source author. If you're borrowing from or referencing from someplace else, just use where it is coming from. And there was also a question about using AI as a way to write it. The official policy is no, you cannot. You're not allowed to use AI, even if you want to sort of improve the argument. But the reason why that is because it changes the overall intention. And I think the assessment here is not looking at how well you're communicating it, but rather how well you're presenting their argument. And the difference here is that, the content matters rather than the way you say it. So I recognize the fact that not everyone would be, too comfortable with writing a lot. So therefore, there is the limit of that word count. But the notion here is to be able to present an argument and then defend it, and then to its logical conclusion. So that's the main thrust of it. So as long as you're doing that, you'll be okay. Okay. Any questions before we leave today? All good? Okay, so well, thank you very much for joining in, and hope today's lecture was insightful. Please feel free to let me know of any questions you may have in the meantime, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll talk about the mobility then. Thanks, everyone.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I just have a question.
Yes, please.
Actually, I emailed